Hello, this is Jim Mitchell, and we are back in our episode of Libertarian Censored Podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So I just got back from a trip to Bermuda, so we have a little bit more than usual to do than usual, but yeah, let's get right into it. So yeah, first we have Republicans planning to label Americans who oppose mass surveillance and data center as quote-unquote terrorists, posted by Education Loc 8134, and that's a post from, let's see, the cross post from the Flocks Around subreddit. I guess it's someone talking about that. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the label of terrorist. It's ultimately going to be a subjective label rather than an objective one. Ultimately, terrorist is just whenever the state commits violence, that's just love. Whenever an individual does it, that's terrorism. Ultimately, that's not why I personally really don't care for the label of terrorist to begin with. It's ultimately going to be leveled at whoever the state's currently opposing. I'm sure when the Democrats get back in power, the Reddit's gonna label anyone who senses all as a terrorist, and Reddit or I should say the DNC will do that, and Reddit will love that. But just go to show you that terrorist is really just a word that really has no meaning anymore other than member of the outgroup. Next we have Trump. Trump hands the World Cup trophy to Spain, then refuses to get off the stage despite FIFA President Gianni Infantino trying to direct him off it. And that was a post by Donald Key, and that's cross post from the Fwama subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump, but at this point, you gotta move on from Trump. You just can't talk about Trump 24/7. We've already been doing Orange Man Bad for 4,000 plus days now. It just kind of gets tiring after talking about it every single day for so long. And he wasn't even in power for four whole years of that. And next we have land value tax is the least bad tax according to Milton Friedman, and that's the YouTube link. Milton Friedman talks about property taxes, posted by Benjamin Liljung, and that's posted by Socialist or Morons. And yeah, personally, as I said in many of the episodes, I personally do think a land value tax is probably one of the most justified taxes. But I think if people don't want to consent to paying it, they shouldn't be forced to pay it either. Just like any other tax. Ultimately, taxation should be voluntary rather than coercive, just like everything else. And that's ultimately, I would say, what the libertarian position is. If you want to pay taxes, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to pay taxes if you don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have America Isn't an Oligarchy from the FP.com, posted by Lemon Limelight. And yeah, personally, I would say that it's kind of an oligarchy, but it doesn't really matter who's in there's always going to be some group in control. If you want to consider an oligarchy, a hierarchy, whatever, I personally don't think what you call it is kind of irrelevant. I personally would kind of consider it to be an oligarchy, but, consider it to be whatever you want to. As George Carlin famously said, it's a big club and you ain't in it, and that's very much how I see politics. There's the ruling class, and then there's the peasants who aren't part of the ruling class, who just exist just to get pushed around. Next, we have Trump's 18-month deadline to cut electricity prices in half has arrived. Rates are up 18% from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. That's just kind of another Orange Man bad headline. But yeah, personally, just go to the government can try to say, oh, we're going to cut electricity prices, but when actually push comes to shove, the government, they're always gonna fail when it comes to stuff like that. Yeah, when it comes to getting kickbacks for their friends, they always seem to succeed when it comes to that. Just go show they're operating in their own self-interest. Something like cutting electricity prices, which isn't in their own self-interest. They're always going to screw stuff like that up. When it comes to giving their friends money and positions in government, they'll always get away with stuff like that, because that's very much how government works. Government's always going to be self-interested, just like everyone else is always going to be self-interested. Next, we have left-wing dictator says Nicaragua will no longer hold elections from Reuters.com, posted by Socialist or Morons. And yeah, personally, I don't really care about that, but ultimately, I think elections are overrated anyway. Elections are just the people in positions of authority use them to justify their own authoritarian decisions. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for a lot of dictators, but I do at least appreciate how they're not even making a pretext of of, oh, I have the will the will the consent of the people on my side, because elections are oftentimes just for show. I'm very much the type of, if voting mattered, they wouldn't let us do it, and that so personally, I personally, I don't really care. I don't think it really matters. Authoritarians are just an authoritarian, regardless of which government system is in place. It doesn't really matter if there's elections or not. Next we have, so go arrest them and deport them, posted by Donald Key, and that's a screenshot of a tweet from Thomas Massey, who quote tweeted, "Libs of TikTok, holy crap, Steve Miller just revealed the estimates show about a third of the nation's CDLs were issued to illegal aliens," and Thomas Massey said, "Good news, the CDL is addressed in a picture, so just go arrest and deport the holder. Also, if these illegals are employed, the employer has an address, easiest crack than ever. Reality, Miller's claim is bogus, or the administration doesn't really care and won't do anything." And yeah, personally, just go show you, a lot of politics is just really posturing and grandstanding. They'll say stuff, but they either don't really mean it, or it's not true, and it just goes to show you that, politics isn't real. It's pretty much just WWE. Next we have, SCOTUS said you can't lose gun rights for smoking pot, but you could still lose a government license to work, from Reason.com, posted by Jaya Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if you want to smoke pot, you should be able to. If you want to have guns, you should be able to. Justify doing whatever you want to. And, if people don't want to hire you because you have guns and smoke pot, they should be able to. But, it shouldn't be a state law that they can't hire you. And that's very much the libertarian position. Hire whoever you want to hire. I definitely do think, if the government doesn't want to hire you, it shouldn't be forced to do so. But that's kind of gets into the problem of government jobs. If the government has any standards, you could argue those standards are anti-libertarian. And also, but ultimately, I think people are going to justify. If you want to justify the government's justify not giving people a government license to work because they have guns and smoke pot, ultimately people are going to justify. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. And that's very much how the world's going to work. It doesn't really matter what system of the government's in place. People are always going to justify what they want to justify, and it doesn't really. And yeah, that's my faults there. Next, we have, authoritarians are making it illegal to criticize Zionism in Germany, posted by Andrew PC 555, and that's it looks like they took a screenshot of Google or something, and it's a bunch of articles on that, I guess. Fire for Foundation for Voice and Expression posted, German bill criminalized denying Israel's right to exist. DW.com posted, Germany may make it illegal to deny Israel's right to exist. JNS.org posted, German parliament advances bill criminalizing denial of, I guess, Israel's right to exist. Ynet News posted, Germany's parliament advances historic measure against. And yeah, personally, I think, that definitely goes against freedom of speech. If you want to deny Israel's right to exist, you should be able to. If other people don't want to like that and boycott you and shun you as a result, I think they should be able to. But I don't think the state should be stopping individuals for their freedom of speech. It's like that woman in Minnesota who called the kid the M word, and now they're trying to charge her in court for that. And I personally don't think you should be going into the inner city and yelling the M word at the top of your lungs. But ultimately, that's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means all words at any time. It might be a horrible decision, like yelling the M word in the inner city at the top of your lungs, or yelling "I have a bomb" on an airplane. But ultimately, that's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, is all words at any time. And if people want to justify saying something, no matter how bad an idea it is, they should have every right to do that. Next, we have South Carolina law prohibits tattoo parlors near churches. A new lawsuit calls that unconstitutional, from Reason.com, posted by Jaya Porcupine. And I would agree with that. Ultimately, I think if people want to open their tattoo parlors near a church, they should be able to. Ultimately, if it's not on church property and it's their private property, they should be able to open whatever business they want to there. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ICE is arresting relatives who came forward to take custody of migrant children in federal shelters, from TexasTribune.org, posted by FlimsyOut5563. And yeah, personally, ICE can arrest whoever it feels like. And that's pretty much what they're just any other government agency in that regard. They ultimately, those in positions of government authority have the legal discretion to arrest whoever they feel like for whatever reason they feel like. And oftentimes, there's really nothing you can do about it. Reddit, of course, cares about ICE, but, there are tons of other alphabet agencies as well that can arrest people for bullshit reasons. But, of course, Reddit only cares about ICE because that's the one in the headlines currently. Next, we have Trump's new 50% tariff on Canadian goods is actually an admission that trade wars don't work from Reason.com, hosted by Chatty Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian positions, if people want to pay tariffs, they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to pay tariffs if they don't want to. Ultimately, it should be up to, a tariff is just a tax on imported goods, and, I think if people want to consent to taxes, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to do them if they don't want to, just like if everything else. If you want to consent to something, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to do something if you don't want to, and that's very much the libertarian position on taxation, of which tariffs are one of. Next, we have hand jobs, oral sex, and anal. Pete Heggs' pastor wants gay men prosecuted for these acts from YouTube.com, posted by Knee Concussions. And that's the video from an uncloseted media, which is the outlet they work on. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian position is, if people want to do hand jobs, oral sex, or anal sex, they should be able to, among consenting individuals who are of age. I think they should be able to. But, I personally, I don't really care for all those. But, if they want to justify doing them, they should be able to. Ultimately, I don't think they should be doing them in public. I definitely think that should be stigmatized. But, ultimately, I think, that's very much, you're free not to like those. But, people should be able to do whatever they want to with their own bodies, even if, it's something that, you don't really like. And, if you don't like anal sex or oral sex or hand jobs, that's fine. But as long as people are keeping it to themselves among voluntarily consenting individuals, I think that's completely fine. Of course, I would prefer that those individuals be of age and of sound mind. But, ultimately, people are going to justify what they justify. And that does include, some bad stuff when it comes to people who are unable to consent, stuff like that. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Ken Paxton and his team abruptly shut down a news conference in bail after journalists tried to ask him about his various scandals. And that's I guess a cross post from the underreported news subreddit posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I think if Ken Paxton just wants to leave when people bring up his scandals, that's fine. But it just goes to show you that at this point, Reddit's pretty much going to be only going after Ken Paxton since he has an R next to his name. They don't really care about anything that James Tallarico does since he has a D next to his name. Reddit, I don't think it really matters who wins. I personally probably think Paxton will win because Tallarico has so many clips mentioning transgender children to, I think, realistically win in Texas. But, ultimately, I don't think it really matters too much because those in positions... it's all just theater, really. The Democrats and the Republicans are pretty much two birds of the same, two wings of the same ship bird, and they'll both screw you over. Well, pretending to be so different. Well, in reality, they agree on pretty much 95% of stuff, and just use wedge issues like LGBTQ or abortion to divide people. And yeah, so I think it's all just theater, really. Next, we have Wikipedia still describes Nick Shirley's fraud reporting as unsubstantiated, despite one of the subjects of that investigation pleading guilty, posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's a picture of an article from I don't know what thing, and it's a cross post from the Fosburyarian subreddit, and it's I don't know what this article's from, but it's Wikipedia's war over Nick Shirley. A 6-month ideological battle over a single world ordered on Nick Shirley's page reveals exactly how consensus is manufactured on Wikipedia. And I would agree with that. Wikipedia is very much a good tool to control the narrative around any given thing. And, ultimately, that's very important when it comes to stuff these days because, you control the narrative, you control the people. And that's why you see a lot of people these days on social media, they don't let the facts get in the way of a good narrative. If Wikipedia is a private website, it can publish whatever it feels like. But, ultimately, it's very hierarchical, and those in positions of influence very much influence it to a progressive viewpoint, regardless of what the article is. And I think that's important to remember as well. Personally, I don't really care too much for it, but it's definitely a very good tool when it comes to manipulating the narrative, and that's why, I personally I'm relatively active over there because, that's you always gotta control the narrative as much as possible, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Spanish hotel chain ceases operations in Cuba under pressure from Washington, from TheGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if the Spanish hotel chain wanted to cease operations in Cuba, it should be able to, but I don't think the government of another country should be pressuring it to do so. Next, we have Saudis and U.S. strike deal for Kingdom to enrich uranium. Reports say from theGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think if two governments want to make a deal on something like uranium, I think they should be able to. Ultimately, each government's going to justify doing whatever it feels like, and if they want to justify trading their resources, I think they should be able to. Next, we have the erasure of left libertarianism, posted by it's from Ocean and Substack.com, posted by Goran Person 777. And yeah, personally, I think, and it's a cross post from the Libertarian Socialism subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian positions, if you want to be a left or right libertarian, that's fine. You can make the argument that left libertarianism isn't economically libertarian, but I definitely do think a lot of left libertarians are really authoritarians in disguise, because they'll justify any and all economic authoritarianism. But ultimately, use whatever labels you want to. Just because you call yourself a libertarian doesn't mean that you actually are a libertarian. Next, we have Massey says money for farmers in Iran wars. Supplemental is ironic from thehill.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I guess I would kind of agree with that. I don't think we should be bailing out farmers with money that's meant to go to the Iran war. I personally do think, it's probably better to bail out our farmers than any Iran war funding. But, ultimately, the government's going to throw taxpayer money at whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about where it goes to. I guess you could say voting, but, both parties have shown that they're going to spend like there's no tomorrow, so, it really doesn't matter which party you vote for, and any third party has no realistic shot at winning a lot of the time, so that's my thoughts there. Next, we have, let's see, drop sites. Julian Anderone asked Rep. Thomas Massey about the National Defense Authorization Act that votes this week, which included a provision that would move toward integrating the U.S. and Israeli militaries, hosted by Rabat Ascalon. And that's a crosspost from the Thomas Massey subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. and Israeli military should be merging or integrating, but, ultimately, if the government wants to justify doing that, ultimately they're in a position of authority to justify doing that, and oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. If they want to merge with the Israeli military, I personally don't really care about that, but, ultimately they can justify doing whatever they feel like. Next, we have something about accusations and confessions, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the Critical Mineral Bulls subreddit. Steve Miller claims Democrats are crazy communist lunatics who will steal everything Americans know and love. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is both major parties are crazy communist lunatics who will steal everything Americans know and love. But, so ultimately, I don't think it really matters, because, I think they're both controlled by the deep state. And it's all really just theater. We don't really know the people. We don't really know the people behind the scenes who are really making decisions. This is all just a distraction. Next, we have abolishing the Senate might be the DSA's best idea, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a crossbow. It looks like an article from the Atlantic, or abolishing the Senate might be the DSA's best idea. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is we should abolish the Senate and the House and the executive and legislative branches and just let people do their own thing. But I don't know how realistic that is. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, if people want to have a voluntary collectivist government, they should be able to. But I don't think we should have the forced collectivist government that we have currently. With that being said, I think any reduction in the size of government, it would be a good idea. I personally do think getting rid of the Senate's kind of a bold and might be kind of out there idea, but ultimately, it doesn't, it goes against the Constitution. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter what's in the Constitution. It matters what people are wanting to justify at any given moment. If they want to justify getting rid of the Senate, that's fine. Ultimately, people are just going to keep on keeping on regardless. But ultimately, I think one of the big reasons they want to get rid of the Senate is because it's a threat to, they see it as a threat to their own power. But so ultimately, I don't really care for their reason of getting rid of it. But at the very least, it is shrinking the government, which it doesn't really seem to matter which party's in power. The government only grows regardless. So that's why I don't think it's too realistic. It's when it comes to actually happening. Next, we have dozens of new tax increases on Americans solely to please dear leader from AmericaReport.us, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for tax increases, but it doesn't really matter which branch of the new party is in power. Tax increases are coming regardless. Next, we have Hexif is demanding U.S. households pay $5,000 more per year to fund the Pentagon, economist says, from commondreams.org, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think the household should be forced to fund the Pentagon if they don't want to. But the government's in a position to fund whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have IPAC just posted this. House passes NDAA with pro-Israel provisions from YouTube.com, posted by Apollo Delphi, and that's the YouTube video from IPAC. And yeah, personally, I don't really think the NDA, the House should be passing an NDA with pro-Israel provisions or pro-any other country provisions other than the U.S. But ultimately, the House can pass whatever bullshit it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Russia labels Libertarian Party a foreign agent, effectively ending its political activity from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, if Russia wants to label its Libertarian Party as a foreign agent and ban them, I personally don't really care for that. At the very least, I think it's better than how the U.S. treats its Libertarian Party. The U.S. Libertarian Party is illegal, but the U.S. Libertarian Party is still legal, but it's treated like it might as well be illegal. So I have to at least just give Russia the credit for at least making its party illegal rather than making its party essentially illegal by making ballot access and actually winning elections nearly impossible, as in the case when it comes to the U.S. Libertarian Party. Next, we have Colorado Governor Jared Polis warns against socialist agenda within Democratic Party from FoxNews.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that. But ultimately, I think both major parties are already completely captured by the socialists, so I don't think it really matters too much in the long term. Being libertarian makes you realize that the Trojan horse is when it comes to socialism is already true when it comes to both parties rather than just the Democrats. Next, we have Paul, we're worse off than we were before Iran war from thehill.com, posted by Jai Porcupine, and I would agree with that. I don't really care for how Rand Paul sold out to Israel, but ultimately, I definitely do agree that we are worse off than we were before the Iran war. Next, we have Who's Gonna Tell Them That in the Republican primary only Republicans win their elections, posted by Donald Key, and that's a screenshot of a true from Donald Trump. MAGA candidates won everything last night in Arizona, complete sweep. I won Arizona 18 months ago. Democrats are dumbfounded. After decades, Arizona is becoming a Republican state. Congratulations to all, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, that's just Trump trying to jerk himself off, That's pretty much all he does. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for it. But, at some point, it just kind of ceases to be any news. Next, we have DSA isn't infiltrating the Democratic Party. It's just introducing member democracy from post by Don't Reply to this ACC. I guess I mean account. And that's a let's see. I don't know if I can access this right now. Let's see. That's a crosspost from the complaint subreddit. And yeah, personally, if you want to call it infiltrating, I don't think it matters. I think it's all just the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are all just controlled opposition to the deep state that really runs the country. So I don't think it really matters what branch of the Democrats are in control of the Democratic Party, be it the centrist or the socialist. It's all just theater. Well, if you ask me. Next, we have Colin Fitzmaurice, digital creator, reacted to the U.S. House passing a military spending bill that includes Section 219, warning that it would expand U.S.-Israeli defense technology cooperation, posted by Rabat Ascalon. And that's also from the Defund Aid to Israel subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for it. I guess you could say merging them is kind of hyperbolic, because you can make the argument that NORAD is technically a merger of the U.S. and Canadian militaries using the same rhetoric. But personally, I don't think the U.S. military should be integrating its defense technology of any country, be it Israel, Canada, or any other country. I think the U.S. military needs to put itself first, just like we need to put America first. And Trump said that on the campaign trail, but he gets into office and he's just Israel first. It just goes to show politicians are all just phonies. They'll say they're America first, but sell out to whoever whoever gives them the most money, just like they do when it comes to Israel and the IPAC and the Israel lobby. Next we have Trump invents the corporate pardon. Presidents never did that before, but the Supreme Court says corporations are people. American Dystopia from NewRepublic.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but, ultimately, if the president can pardon whoever he wants to pardon, and sometimes you're not going to like who he's going to pardon, and if they want to pardon a corporation, that's their ability to do so. Next, we have GOP rep called Israeli-U.S. Defense Tech Integration Dangerous. The House passed it anyway, from TheIntercept.com, posted by Jay Porcupine. And yeah, as I said earlier, I don't really care for it, but ultimately, the U.S. the U.S. is going to justify, the House is going to justify what everyone's justify. A lot of times it doesn't even really matter, because, the House and the Senate are just rubber stamps when it comes to passing laws. What matters is how laws are enforced. That comes down to the executive branch. So, in reality, I would say you could just get rid of the judicial branch and the legislative branch. The executive branch is the one who enforces the laws, and that's pretty much all that matters. Next, we have Trump administration drops subpoena demanding list of Jews from Penn from NYTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And I personally don't really care for that, but, they can justify subpoenaing whoever they want to. They're in a position of authority to do so. Next, we have Trump considers military strikes in Mali, which would make the 8th country's attack this term, from independent.co.uk, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that either, but, the U.S. government's going to justify bombing whoever wants to bomb. Reddit was fine when Biden was bombing Syria or Obama was bombing Libya, but the Orange Man bombs another country, and suddenly it's the worst thing ever. It's all just theater. That's my thoughts there. Next, we have Massey Hexif is breaking law of Iran war, from thehill.com, posted by Jay Porcupine. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but, ultimately it doesn't really matter what the law is so much as how it's enforced. And ultimately, Hexif is an ability to enforce whatever defensive actions he wants to, since he's the chair of the Department of Defense. Or I guess, he and Trump are now calling it the Department of War. Call it whatever you want to, I guess. Next, we have Trump's newest tariffs are likely illegal too, from Recent.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, as I said with the last post, it doesn't really matter what the law actually is. It matters what people are willing to justify. And also, ultimately, since the executive branch is in charge of enforcing the laws, it can justify doing pretty much whatever it wants to do, even disregarding laws if it feels like it, and enforcing the law how it feels like. Next, we have if you can't name a single mistake, you're not being honest. Posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the TikTok cringe subreddit. And ultimately, and that looks like, I guess, a clip of a representative from Texas saying President Trump hasn't done anything wrong, and I guess some other Republican representatives saying the same thing. And yeah, I would, and I like what, and the OP had no person 100% right 100% of the time. If you genuinely can't name a single thing they've done wrong, you're probably defending the person instead of valuing their actions. Surprising someone that doesn't require you believing they are perfect. And I agree with that, but ultimately, Trump's got a very much big quote personality. But when a Democrat takes power, all the Democrats are going to be unwilling to criticize them. So it's really just how a lot of people treat politics, like team sports, rather than actually having any principles at all. And it just goes to show you, that's what politics really is a lot of the time. No principles, only teams. Next we have, I won 3 times. I'll do it again. Trump said at 2028, presidents will come back. APT, original title from YouTube.com, posted by Dr. Who 07. And that's a YouTube video from APT. And that's, I think Trump was just joking about that since it was the White House Correspondents' Dinner. But you never know if Donald Trump, personally, I'm so tired of him, I might just justify voting for the Democratic Party again. But, I don't think it really matters. If voting really matters, they wouldn't let us do it. Personally, I think everyone's really tired of Donald Trump at this point. I think he stands no chance of winning in 2028. But, ultimately, if he finds a way to justify getting on the ballot again, ultimately, that's on him. I personally think we should just be done with him, but it doesn't really matter. He's just a figurehead and a distraction from what's really happening in the world, and that's very much how he's an asset to the ruling class. He always says something outrageous to distract people from the issues that are really going on, like the Iran war or the Epstein files. And eventually just kind of get tired of it all. I personally just forever ignore the guy rather than take whatever bait he's putting out, like, I'm running for president again, or I'm posting an image of myself as a king, or the Pope, or Jesus. But, ultimately, if you want to take his bait, that's fine. But it just goes to show you that eventually it's like the boy who cried wolf. When he says wolf the first time, it's a big deal. But when he says wolf for the 1,000th time, eventually you stop taking the bait. Next, we have Georgia cops keep getting arrested for misusing flock surveillance data from Reason.com, posted by Giant Porcupine. Yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But I'm glad they're at least holding them accountable. Normally, cops aren't held accountable for misusing any data, for misusing data, or pretty much anything they do. So I'm glad they're at least being held accountable in that instance. Next, we have U.S. accuses American of allegedly wiping his phone using a duress password during border search from TechCrunch.com with My Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, if they want to justify going after that one person for whatever they want to justify going after for, even if it's to say, oh, you wiped your phone, they can justify going after you for whatever reason they want to. They're in a position of state authority to do so. And yeah, I don't really care for that. I don't think they should be going after someone for just wiping his phone. But ultimately they can justify going after you for whatever reason they feel like. Next, we have the one thing both parties never argue about, posted by Robot Ascalon, and that's crosspost from the independent subreddit. And I guess I don't know what that's about. I guess it's probably something about Israel or something. And yeah, personally, I don't think either. I personally think if people want to support Israel, they should be able to. But I don't think people should be forced to support Israel if they don't want to. Same for everything else when it comes to taxpayer dollars. If you want to pay your taxpayer dollars and send them all to Israel, I think you should be able to do so. But ultimately, a lot of taxpayer dollars get sent to Israel without people's consenting to it, and that's why I personally think taxation should be voluntary versus forced. But if taxation did have to be forced, people should at least be able to say directly send with taxpayer dollars to whatever cause they want to, rather than the government just deciding where to send them all willy-nilly. Next, we have I'm Over the Moon. New York small business owners rejoice as Mamdani cuts red tape from TheGuardian.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I do think cutting red tape is good, but ultimately, I think Mamdani is still very much a communist centralization authoritarian, and that's not something I personally care for, even if he is cutting red tape, which I do think is kind of libertarian. Next, we have Florida Wildlife Agency tracked rates using law enforcement database from Reason.com, posted by Giant Porcupine. And I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately the government can track whoever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's very much the NSA spying revelations were well over a decade ago, and it's probably only gotten worse since then. Not to mention foreign governments and private enterprise tracking people as well. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately they can justify doing whatever they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it, especially if they're in a position of state authority. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.